So does it make more sense to rent or to buy a home? I think for a long time, most Americans have been under the default assumption that owning a home is always a better financial move than renting. After all, with renting, you're just throwing money away. With buying a home, homes always go up in value, therefore it is the better investment. However, more recently, because of rising home prices and because of rising interest rates, it's really squeezed Americans' affordability on the home ownership front. I think it's got a lot of people really questioning whether it does make more sense to rent or to buy. Nick Majuli, he writes the blog of Dollars and Data. I referenced it many times on my Money Minute email and even in my weekly podcast. Great blog. Nick Majuli just consistently puts out great content week after week. This one that he recently put out, the Rent versus Buy Calculator, I think is going to be a massively helpful tool, and I'm sure that I'll reference it in conversations with clients in the future as well. Really what it does is allows you to do a true side-by-side comparison of what makes more financial sense. And the way that we have to do this is input not only the monthly rent and home price, but you have to consider all costs associated with home ownership. The assumption that a lot of people make with home ownership is because, well, when I'm buying a home, I'm paying down the mortgage over time, therefore I'm building equity in the house, so gradually I'm getting more and more ownership of the house, but also homes tend to go up in value over time. So at the end of 30 years, I have a house that's paid off and it's worth more than what I paid for it at the beginning, so now I have this great asset that I own free and clear, whereas if I rent for 30 years, what do I have to show for it at the end? But that's not a true comparison because first of all, if you rent, almost certainly your monthly costs associated with housing are going to be less than with home ownership. What are you going to do with that extra money? If you invest that as opposed to owning a home, what would that look like? And also with home ownership, include all of your housing related costs that go along with that. Not just principal and interest, but you have to think about your insurance, your property taxes, and most importantly, your maintenance. A lot of times people forget that maintenance is a significant cost, especially over a long time frame with a house. So what the rent versus buy calculator allows you to do is put in all of that information. What the home price would be, what the monthly rent would be. So if you're comparing, okay, I'm thinking about renting a house in this price range versus buying a house in this price range. And then you can put in other properties like how much will I be paying in taxes? How much of a down payment will I be making? What's the current mortgage interest rate? How much would I expect to earn on my investments on the amount that I would be the amount that I would be investing if I rented instead? And after putting all that in, it will give you a decision and it'll show you, okay, over time, the value of your home compared to that portfolio if you invested the difference. And I think what you're going to find is a lot of times you'll be surprised with the answer because home ownership costs are a lot more than people really think. And when you compare, yes, the final value of the home after a long period of time versus how much you've actually spent, your real return on investment is not nearly as high as some people assume. I think the reason people feel like their primary home is such a great investment is because they don't really think about all those costs that stack up over time. They just kind of see the end point. They're like, wow, I bought this house 20 years ago. Look what it's worth now. Not also considering inflation and what that's done over time and the fact that their income is significantly different than what their income was when they first purchased the home. So anyway, a great tool. I just put that out in the recent Money Minute email of Dollars and Data if you want to look that up on your own, the rent versus buy calculator. Next article that I wanted to talk about has to do with digital shoplifting. And I must admit, before I had came across this article, I was not familiar with the term digital shoplifting. I wasn't completely aware of what that was. After reading a little bit more about it, I can totally see why this has become a little bit of a more recent phenomenon. There was a survey done where they surveyed Gen Z and millennial Americans, but all Gen Z, but all the respondents had a six-figure income. So these are relatively well-to-do Gen Z and millennials. And they asked them a series of questions related to digital shoplifting. And what is digital shoplifting? Well, things like ordering a product online and claiming that it was defective or never arrived when you actually received it in good order, or disputing a charge on your credit card statement saying, oh, I didn't order this thing when you actually did, or ordering an item that was something that you really actually only needed for one use. You used it and then fraudulently claimed that it was defective or no longer needed and then returned it to get your full refund back. In the survey, half of millennials and 55% of Gen Z admitted to digital shoplifting within the last year. That's interesting because that's as many people as said yes. I would venture to guess that there are more that actually had done that but did not feel comfortable responding yes on the survey. That's the thing about surveys. You're leaving up to how people self-report that. So I would think it's probably more than admitted to doing that. And also kind of interesting how people were pretty open to admitting that they had done digital shoplifting. And why is this? Ironically enough, though, one of the items that the article pointed out is that higher income Gen Z and millennials are much more likely to commit digital shoplifting as opposed to physical shoplifting. Lower income individuals don't do digital shoplifting at nearly as high of a rate, or at least don't admit to it at nearly as high of a rate. However, the converse is true, and that is higher income Gen Z and millennials do not commit physical shoplifting nearly to the degree that lower income people of that age would. So interesting. And there's probably several reasons for this. One of them being the stakes aren't nearly as high with digital shoplifting. Worst case scenario is your claim is denied and you end up paying full price for that item. There's really not that much of a downside. I've never heard of police being called to your doorstep or getting charges for saying that an item was defective when it wasn't. So there's really not a lot of risk in digital shoplifting. But also, I think a lot of Gen Z and millennials feel justified saying things like, well, it's a large company. It's a victimless crime in that sense. I'm not really hurting anybody by doing this. There's been a lot of online trends and so-called influencers that talk about using these, quote unquote hacks and things that they've done to get free merchandise. And so interesting that attitude and how that practice has evolved, the idea of digital shoplifting. So I found that to be a very interesting article. Moving on to another article that has nothing to do with digital shoplifting, moving now actually to Social Security and the other end of the age bracket. Does it make more sense? This article took a deep dive into, does it make more sense to wait to claim Social Security or to claim it as early as possible and then go ahead and invest the difference? Just so you're aware, the way it currently stands in the U.S. is the earliest that you can claim Social Security is at age 62. But if you claim at 62, you will have to get a reduced benefit. Full retirement age is 67. So if you want to get your full benefit that you're entitled to, you have to wait until age 67. If you take it at age 62, you're going to get about 70% of what you otherwise would be entitled to. However, you can wait as long as age 70. At age 70, you then have to start taking your Social Security benefit. But for every year that you wait, you do get an additional 8% bump in your monthly benefit. So the question then becomes, when is the best time to take Social Security? And the approach that some people have is, I'm going to go ahead and claim at 62, but I'm not going to use that money yet. I'm going to take that monthly money and then I'm going to start to invest it for the next 8 years. And then with that investment, I'll actually end up with more money in retirement at age 70 if I had just waited to claim Social Security at that age. What the article does is it just really delves into what is the best strategy, and they even explore, would it make more sense to buy an annuity instead? And the bottom line, long story short, what they came to the conclusion is, in order for the approach of taking the money early and investing to work, you'd have to invest the money pretty aggressively in order to generate enough of a return for it to be worth your while, which means you'd have to be in your 60s investing almost fully, if not completely fully, in stocks in order to generate a strong return. And generally speaking, for those who are at retirement or close to retirement, you don't want to have a very aggressive portfolio because the name of the game at that point is more preservation of your nest egg as opposed to trying to maximize your growth. And really what they found is that on balance, the more conservative and better financial move is actually to just go ahead and wait and delay your Social Security as opposed to trying to quote unquote game the system by getting clever and taking early and trying to invest on your own. So I thought that was interesting because I've heard of people argue that in both directions. And then last article is an interesting breakdown on what's in a name and naming trends. This is always something interesting to me because not only just names and having gone through the process with my wife and I of naming our 3 kids, but also looking at a little bit of a statistical analysis, which anytime you're talking about statistics and graphs, you're speaking my love language. So I found this to be a very interesting article. And just kind of the science of how names go in and out of popularity, whether they're names of real people or fictional. And they give several interesting examples, starting with popular names that come from movies. It's interesting seeing names that were relatively unheard of, things like Elsa from Frozen, or Ariel from The Little Mermaid, or Forrest from Forrest Gump, and how right after the movie those names really took off in popularity. And did they have staying power, or did they just kind of have a little bit of a blip? So for instance, Ariel, the name Ariel, before The Little Mermaid came out, it was almost non-existent before the 1970s, and then between the 70s and when Little Mermaid came out in the early 90s, or I think late 80s, very sparsely used. But then of course a huge jump, but then it also came back down quite a bit. So there was a big jump in the 90s of girls being named Ariel. And there's something interesting about how those names just kind of get in the cultural zeitgeist for a little and get a little bit of a bump, but then they peter out over time. But then there's also some names that have a little bit longer staying power because the person or the character is such a huge part of the cultural conversation. It's such a huge cultural touch point. So for instance, the name Elvis, there was hardly anybody named Elvis before, of course, Elvis Presley. Well, when he came on the scene with the Ed Sullivan Show, the name shot up in popularity, then dwindled a few years later after that, but then shot up again after he died, and then dwindled again. But then there seems to be have been a resurgence kind of in the 2000s to 2010 of the name Elvis. So there's a certain, how people's connotation of a name sort of ebbs and flows over time. So Elvis, of course, very popular when he was alive, but then when he dies, there's sort of a nostalgia and people returning to that name, and then it dwindles again. But then when there's been enough time removed that Elvis is now no longer something that a new generation didn't even grow up with Elvis. They only kind of know him through recordings and through secondhand experiences of other people. Then it kind of comes back. And so, and who knows, maybe we're on the verge of another wave of the name Elvis getting popular. But then it's not even just fictional people. It's not even just musicians. Celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, the name Leonardo has shot up in popularity and continues to grow, actually, ever since he came on the scene and became famous. And then it's also interesting how certain names can be in decline over time and then roar back. Names that are a little bit more, you have a little bit more of a pedigree and a longer history. So for instance, names that used to, if you said the name, you'd think of, oh, that's somebody that was born in like the 1920s would have a name like that. And a great example is the name Archie. Archie used to be a very popular name, and then it really continued to dwindle throughout the 1900s, just kind of a straight line down till you got to the 2000s. And then it shot back up here a few years ago because Meghan Markle and Prince Harry named their son Archie, and then all of a sudden that name seems to have come back. But also, the article gives some interesting examples of names that decreased in popularity, because all the examples I've given so far are examples of names that grew in popularity because of somebody famous, but sometimes names can come with a negative connotation. So a great example would be Marilyn Monroe. The name Marilyn was a very popular name before Marilyn Monroe became famous, and then it just dropped off a table because nobody wanted their little girl to be associated with Marilyn Monroe, and understandably so, I guess. But also names like Monica, because of the Monica Lewinsky scandal in the 1990s. Monica was a very popular name in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s, and it was somewhat on the decline, but then it just dropped off a cliff in the 1990s, and now hardly anybody names their daughter Monica because of the association. Also, similarly, ironically enough, Hillary as well. When Bill Clinton was elected, dropped off a cliff, because people don't tend to want to name their kid with somebody who's famous and has a very polarized image. Even if a lot of people tend to like that person, if there's a significant number of people that don't like a person with that name, parents tend to want to avoid that name for their child, and understandably so. Well, that's going to do it for our monthly roundup of articles. One thing I want to point out before we go, if you didn't get a chance to listen to my conversation with Dr. Tim and Dr. Maureen Gall, great conversation, wonderful couple. Their story is something that has inspired me and challenged me. I think it will do the same for you. People that really just thought about money and mission and purpose, and were willing to really think those deep thoughts and allow it to change them and make some pretty ambitious changes in their life. And I want you to listen to their story, and I hope it'll be something that challenges you and inspires you as well. So you can listen to that on the podcast or on the YouTube channel as well. All right, well, have a great day, and I will see you on the next episode.